What secret ended your relationship immediately? My coworker laughed as she described how her college friend group scammed a quiet kid into raising money for a fake charity, then humiliated him when they revealed it was all a prank. And the most disturbing part wasn't the cruelty, but that she still thought it was hilarious a decade later. In my late 20s, I had a coworker I became pretty close with. We'd grab lunch together, complain about work, the usual casual friendship. She always had a lot of dramatic stories about her old college friend group. Most of them were the typical messy early 20s stuff: petty arguments, bad relationships, dumb parties. One afternoon, we were sitting in a cafe, and she started telling a story that she clearly thought was hilarious. She was smiling the entire time. Apparently, back in college, her friend group used to run these social experiments on people they didn't like. That's what she called them. One example she told me about involved a quiet guy in their dorm building. According to her, they pretended to be friendly with him for months, inviting him to hang out, helping him with assignments, acting like he'd finally found a group of friends. Then one weekend, they convinced him to help them with a fake charity fundraiser they had supposedly organized for a local shelter. He spent days helping them set up tables, carry boxes, and even convinced a few of his own friends to donate. There was no charity. They had printed fake flyers and donation jars just to see how long they could keep the lie going. At the end of the night, they packed everything up, took the money, and told the guy it had all been a prank. According to her, they thought his reaction was the funniest part. She said he just stood there looking confused and embarrassed while everyone else laughed. While she was telling the story, she kept waiting for me to laugh too. I didn't say anything. I just remember staring at my coffee, trying to process what she'd just told me so casually. The thing that bothered me most wasn't just what they did. It was that years later she still described it like it was some legendary inside joke. No regret, no discomfort, just pride. Story 2. I spent 2 years wondering why my old friend Daniel vanished from social media without a trace, until I accidentally found a news article revealing he'd been arrested for stealing thousands in donated goods from charity warehouses, selling them online while everyone thought he'd just gone quiet. Years ago, I had a friend from university named Daniel. He was one of those people everyone liked without really trying. Quiet, creative, and always sketching something in a notebook. After graduation, he moved to another city and worked random jobs while trying to build a portfolio as a freelance illustrator. We kept in touch for a few years through messages and occasional gaming nights online. Then one day, he just vanished. No goodbye post, no replies. His social media accounts stopped updating entirely. At first, we assumed he was just taking a break from the internet. Months turned into a year though, and it started to feel strange. A few of us tried messaging him, but nothing ever came back. Every now and then I'd search his name out of curiosity. Mostly it was the same old stuff: an outdated art page, an old profile somewhere, nothing new. About 2 years after he disappeared, I randomly stumbled onto something that made my stomach drop. I had searched his name again, and one of the results was a small local news article from the city he'd moved to. The name was uncommon enough that I clicked it immediately. It was him. Apparently, he'd been working part-time at a community warehouse that handled donated goods for several charities. According to the article, an internal audit discovered that a lot of valuable items, electronics, rare instruments, even antiques, had quietly gone missing over the course of more than a year. They eventually traced it back to him. From what the report described, he had been slowly taking donations that were supposed to go to families in need and selling them online under different accounts. It wasn't just a couple things either. The total value was massive by the time they caught it. Story 3. At a family birthday dinner, I sat smiling as my girlfriend's relatives casually reminisced about the old days, until her uncle started bragging about how he and his brothers made money informing on their own neighbors to militias, knowing full well those families would be taken away and never seen again. A few years ago, I was dating someone whose family seemed perfectly normal on the surface. Weekend dinners, old family photos on the walls, the usual stories about childhood and grandparents. Nothing about them ever seemed particularly strange. One evening, we were visiting her uncle's house for a birthday gathering. At some point, the older relatives started reminiscing about the old days in their hometown. At first, it sounded like typical nostalgia about tough times and how everyone struggled back then. Then one of them started telling a story that made the whole room shift. Apparently, decades earlier, during a period of violent conflict in their region, several local militias were competing for control. According to them, her uncle and a couple of other relatives neighbors had made money by acting as informants. That's the word they used. They would quietly report which families in the neighborhood were suspected of supporting rival groups. Not people they didn't know. These were neighbors they had grown up with, people who lived on the same street. What happened after those reports was never said outright, but everyone at the table clearly understood. Entire households were taken away during raids and never came back. Story 4. After a client dinner, my coworker Mark leaned in like he was about to tell me a funny work story. Instead, he casually admitted he drained his family's joint savings account to gamble on risky trades, lost most of it, and was just hoping the market would bounce back before his wife checked the balance. I worked closely with a guy named Mark on a long-term project. We weren't best friends, but we spent enough time together in meetings, travel, and late work nights that you end up talking about life stuff. He always talked about his family, his wife, and their young kid, and seemed proud of them. One evening after a client dinner, we were sitting at the bar in the hotel lobby while waiting for a ride back. Out of nowhere, he started talking about how stressful his home life had been lately. I thought he was just venting about work-life balance. Instead, he leaned in like he was sharing some clever trick and told me that he had secretly emptied a big chunk of their joint savings account months earlier. At first, I thought he meant for an investment or something, but then he explained that he had used the money to fund a private trading account that his wife didn't know about. Apparently, he'd been following some online group promising huge returns and decided not to tell her because, in his words, she'd panic and try to stop me. The way he described it made it clear he had taken money that was supposed to be for their mortgage and their kids' future and gambled it away in risky trades. And the worst part? Most of it was already gone. What really unsettled me was how casually he talked about it. He laughed and said if the market eventually bounced back, he'd just move the money back before she ever noticed. Story 5. During a casual lunch conversation about saving money, my coworker Trevor proudly explained his perfect system for extra cash, volunteering at charity donation drives so he could steal the best clothes and electronics before they were ever cataloged, then showed me the designer headphones he'd just taken from a homeless family's donation. I used to work with a guy named Trevor at a logistics company. We weren't close friends, but we shared an office space for months, so we ended up talking quite a bit during slow afternoons. Most conversations were harmless, sports, weekend plans, complaining about deadlines. One day during lunch, the topic somehow drifted to side hustles and saving money. Trevor suddenly got this smug grin and said he had figured out a perfect system to bring in extra cash without doing much work. Naturally, I asked what he meant. He explained that every year he signed up to volunteer for several community fundraising drives. At first, I assumed he meant charity runs or donation events, but then he clarified that his role was collecting physical donations, clothes, household items, sometimes electronics. The way he described it made my stomach tighten. According to him, whenever something valuable came through, like good jackets, brand name shoes, or small gadgets, he would quietly take them home before they were cataloged. He said nobody noticed because there were always huge piles of donations moving through the system. He actually laughed while telling me this and said people were too generous for their own good. Then he showed me a pair of nearly new designer headphones he'd taken from a recent drive. He seemed proud of it, like he had beaten the system somehow. Story 6. My quiet literature classmate who loved supernatural folklore seemed harmless until she looked me dead in the eyes and said she'd been researching how to absorb people's energy, that she thought I'd be a good source, and kept begging me to let her try draining me just once so she could prove it worked. Back in my first year of university, I became friends with a girl from one of my literature classes. She was quiet but very intense about the things she liked: mystery novels, old folklore, and anything related to the supernatural. At first, I just thought she had quirky interests, which isn't unusual in college. Over time, we started studying together in the library and occasionally grabbing coffee after class. During those conversations, she would sometimes talk about feeling like she didn't fit in anywhere. She came from a very strict household and said she always had to hide parts of herself growing up. I tried to be supportive because she seemed genuinely lonely. Things started to get uncomfortable about a few months into the friendship. One evening while we were walking back from campus, she began talking about how she believed certain people could sense energy from others. I assumed she meant it metaphorically, like being emotionally intuitive, but she kept going and explained that she had been reading forums and books about people who believed they could absorb energy from others to make themselves feel stronger. Then she looked directly at me and said she thought I might be a good source. I laughed awkwardly because I thought she was joking, but she kept insisting she was serious. She said she had tried it before with someone else, and it involved holding on to them and focusing until she felt their strength transfer. The more she described it, the more uneasy I felt. It sounded less like a harmless belief and more like she was convinced she could drain something from people without their consent. I told her that made me uncomfortable and tried to change the subject. Unfortunately, She kept bringing it up in later conversations, suggesting we could try it just once so she could prove it worked. Story 7. The senior colleague who mentored me for years, gave me career advice, and kept family photos on his desk, the one I trusted completely, was quietly exposed for cornering a junior employee in the supply room, blocking the door, and pressuring her to stay after work with him until another coworker accidentally walked in and stopped it. For several years at my previous job, there was a senior employee named Carl who kind of took me under his wing. He had been with the company forever and knew how everything worked. When I first started, he helped me figure out the systems, introduced me to people, and gave career advice. Because of that, I always looked at him as someone trustworthy. He talked constantly about his family too. Pictures of his kids on his desk, stories about weekend barbecues with his wife. On the surface, he seemed like the definition of a reliable, stable guy. Then one week something strange happened. One of the junior employees in another department suddenly requested a transfer away from the floor where Carl worked. It was abrupt enough that people started whispering about it. At first, nobody really knew what was going on. A few days later, the story started circulating through the office. Apparently, during a late shift, they had both been working overtime in the same area. At some point, Carl had cornered her near the supply room and started pressuring her to stay after work with him. She kept telling him no and trying to leave, but he kept blocking the doorway and making increasingly uncomfortable comments. Eventually, another coworker happened to walk by and noticed the tension. From what I heard, the situation ended quickly once someone else was present, but the whole interaction had shaken her badly enough that she reported it. When I first heard the rumor, I didn't want to believe it. It just didn't match the person I thought I knew. But over the next couple of days, several different coworkers who had been involved in handling the report confirmed the same version of events. That's when it really sank in. The man who had spent years giving me advice about professionalism had apparently been making someone else feel trapped and unsafe at work. After that, I couldn't see him the same way. Every friendly conversation we'd ever had suddenly felt different in hindsight. I stopped stopping by his desk, stopped asking for guidance, and kept all interactions strictly professional. Story 8. The senior colleague who mentored me for years, gave me career advice, and kept family photos on his desk, the one I trusted completely, was quietly exposed for cornering a junior employee in the supply room, blocking the door, and pressuring her to stay after work with him until another coworker accidentally walked in and stopped it. I'll take a quick break here to remind you, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let us know in the comments if you're enjoying the story, and tell us if something like this has ever happened to you. Story 8. The friend who always talked about supporting his struggling family and borrowed small loans for emergencies turned out to be funding an underground gambling habit. And after disappearing completely, we realized he'd been running the same sob story on all of us simultaneously to cover his betting debts. I used to know a guy in my friend group who everyone considered incredibly responsible. He always talked about how much pressure he was under supporting his family. Whenever money came up, he'd mention how most of his paycheck went toward helping relatives who were going through a really rough time. Because of that story, people trusted him a lot. Every few months, he'd ask someone in the group for a small loan. Never huge amounts, just enough that you didn't feel suspicious. He always framed it the same way: an unexpected bill, medication someone needed, or travel expenses to visit family. He would promise to pay it back once things stabilized. Some people even refused repayment when he offered, because they believed he was dealing with so much already. For a long time, nobody doubted him. He was friendly, polite, and always seemed genuinely stressed when talking about his situation. Then one evening, everything unraveled. A mutual acquaintance showed up looking for him and asked if we had seen him recently. When we asked why, the guy explained that several people were trying to collect money he owed from betting debts. Apparently, he had been spending nights at underground card games and sports betting spots. At first, we thought there had to be some kind of mistake, but within a few days, more details started coming out. Different people realized they had all lent him money around the same time periods. He had been losing big at those games. The stories about emergencies and struggling relatives suddenly lined up a little too perfectly with the dates he needed cash. When confronted, he avoided everyone for a while and then eventually disappeared altogether. Phone disconnected, apartment cleared out, social media gone. Story 9. My boyfriend casually explained that his parents paid for his entire college education while letting his brother drown in student loans because years earlier he discovered a dark family secret and blackmailed them into cutting him a deal to keep quiet. Years ago, I was dating dating someone whose family owned a small regional company. It had been around for decades, and a lot of their relatives worked there in different roles. The business wasn't doing well toward the end, and everyone in the family was constantly stressed about what would happen if it closed. One weekend, I spent the day with his family during a get-together. The mood was tense because they had just announced layoffs, and were trying to figure out what to do next. At one point, his younger brother and I ended up talking in the kitchen. He mentioned how worried he was about paying off the loans he took out for school now that the company might collapse. It surprised me because I had always heard my boyfriend talk about how their parents helped with education costs. Later that night, after we got back to his apartment, I casually asked him how that worked. I wasn't accusing him of anything. I was just curious why the situation was different between the two siblings. He hesitated for a long time before answering. Eventually, he admitted that he had been given a deal years earlier. When he was still living at home, he had discovered something about one of his parents that would have caused a huge scandal for the family and possibly hurt the business. Instead of telling anyone, he confronted that parent privately. According to him, they struck an agreement. If he stayed quiet about it and made sure the rest of the family never found out, they would cover every expense related to his college education. He told the story almost casually, like it was some clever negotiation he had made when he was younger. What bothered me wasn't just the secret itself. It was the fact that he had watched his siblings struggle financially for years while knowing exactly why the support had been unequal, and he never said a word because the arrangement benefited him. Hearing that completely changed how I saw him. Story 10. My college friend Evan told us he'd landed a dream job on a confidential government engineering project abroad and would be unreachable for months, until his wife contacted me to reveal he'd actually been in court the entire time, facing multiple harassment charges, and had constructed an elaborate year-long lie to cover up his hearings while everyone believed he was working overseas back in college. I became friends with a guy named Evan. We met through mutual acquaintances and instantly clicked over video games and music. At first, he seemed reliable, funny, and genuinely easy to talk to. Over the years, even after graduation, we stayed in touch online, playing games late into the night and chatting about life. Eventually, he told us he had started dating someone new and that he was planning a career move that sounded impressive. He said he was going to be working on a government-funded engineering project abroad, and because of its confidentiality, he wouldn't be reachable for months. Of course, we believed him. He had a background in engineering and had always been detail-oriented. Fast forward a year, his wife reached out to me and a couple of our mutual friends with an urgent message. What she revealed completely shocked me. Evan had fabricated the entire story about the overseas project. In reality, he had been involved in multiple harassment cases with a previous partner and had been under investigation. Every interview he claimed to be doing for his new job was actually court-related, attending hearings, dealing with lawyers, and lying to everyone he knew about where he actually was. Even worse, he had spun a web of lies so tightly that nobody, not his colleagues, not his friends, not his spouse, had any idea. Every story he told over that year had been a carefully constructed cover. I remember staring at my phone for a long time after reading her messages. The person I thought I knew, the friend I trusted, had been manipulating everyone around him for personal gain and to hide serious wrongdoing. Story 11. After a few weeks of dating, I was casually chatting with her about childhood memories when she laughed and described how she used to crush insects open to see what was inside, then moved on to stories about experimenting on neighborhood animals like they were hilarious pranks. And the terrifying part was how proudly she told it, like she expected me to be impressed. I had been seeing someone for a few weeks. Things were light and fun at first, nothing serious, but we clicked over movies and music. One evening, we were hanging out at her apartment, chatting about childhood memories. She laughed and said, without missing a beat, that when she was around 7 or 8, she liked to collect bugs and insects, but sometimes she would crush them open to see what was inside. I forced a laugh, thinking maybe I had misheard. But then she went on, giving a few other little stories of similar experiments on animals in her neighborhood, and spoke about them as if they were hilarious pranks. Something in me just snapped. The way she recounted it, so casually, so proudly, made me realize that her sense of morality was deeply off. It wasn't just about being a little curious as a kid. There was something in the way she framed it that made my skin crawl. I didn't say anything at the time. I quietly stopped responding to her messages and never made plans again. It didn't feel safe or sane to stay connected. Story 12. 12. When I finally trusted my partner enough to share a painful secret from my past, his face twisted with disgust. And for the next year, he used my deepest trauma as ammunition in every argument, mocking me, controlling me, and convincing me I was unworthy of love until I barely recognized myself. We had been dating for over a year when I decided to open up to my partner about something deeply personal from my past, something I had never told anyone. I trusted him, thinking he would understand. Instead, the reaction was completely unrecognizable. His face twisted with anger, and he accused me of lying to him my entire life. He told me that my past made me unworthy of love, and that I had somehow trapped him into a relationship with someone he couldn't respect. From that moment on, everything changed. Arguments weren't just disagreements. They became weapons. He would dredge up my past repeatedly, mocking and belittling me whenever he felt like it. Emotional jabs turned into controlling behavior, then physical intimidation, and eventually coercive demands. Every small discussion became a test I couldn't win. It didn't end immediately, but the trust had evaporated. The person I thought I knew, the one I loved, was gone. I spent months feeling trapped, constantly walking on eggshells, and trying to reason with someone who refused to see their own cruelty. Eventually, I summoned the courage to leave. He tried to justify himself, claiming I had provoked him by being honest. But I couldn't stay in a relationship where someone weaponized my trauma against me. Story 13. The guy I played video games with for months, the one I dismissed as just rough around the edges, casually admitted over chat that he might have sexually abused his neighbor's young niece while babysitting because he was drunk and didn't remember, and the chilling part was how little he seemed to care. A few years ago, I was part of an online gaming community that had a tight-knit group of regulars. One of the guys, let's call him Jake, always seemed rough around the edges, cocky, a little crude, but I could tolerate it because he was entertaining and skilled in the games we played. One night, a mutual friend reached out and told me something that made my blood run cold. Jake had been babysitting his neighbor's young niece, and she confided to her parents that he had been trying to get her to do inappropriate things in the house. They hadn't overreacted at first. They just wanted to verify, but the story was detailed and consistent. I confronted him privately, thinking maybe there had been some huge misunderstanding. His response, he shrugged and muttered, "I don't remember. Maybe. I was drunk." That was the instant line in the sand. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I realized then that he wasn't just reckless. He was dangerous and unrepentant. My tolerance, the brief camaraderie we had shared over games, evaporated immediately. Story 14. Midway through laughing over coffee, my girlfriend casually confessed that she'd spent her teenage years faking broken bones, fake allergies, and staged fainting spells to manipulate everyone around her. And when I sat there horrified, she smiled like she expected me to be impressed by her creativity. We were at a small cafe after work, laughing about nothing in particular, when she suddenly leaned over and said, "You know, I've always had a thing for getting attention when I want it." I laughed at first, thinking she was joking. Then she went on, describing in detail all the illnesses she had claimed to have as a teenager. Broken bones that weren't broken, allergies that didn't exist, fainting spells she staged, just to manipulate teachers, family, and friends into giving her favors. She told the stories like they were clever pranks, like I should admire her creativity. I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't cute. It wasn't funny. It was disturbing. The realization hit me instantly. If she could fabricate sicknesses with no remorse to control people, what else could she lie about, manipulate, or exploit? I didn't need another example. That weekend, I ended it. No long arguments, no drawn-out confrontation. It wasn't about anger. It was about self-preservation. I couldn't trust someone who treated truth and empathy as tools for their own amusement. Story 15. My new roommate seemed perfectly normal until a friend pulled me aside at a concert and whispered that years ago, he'd assaulted her, served time for it, and still carried around the letters he'd written begging for forgiveness like some twisted souvenir. A few years ago, I moved in with a new roommate, thinking it would be a fresh start. On the surface, he seemed normal, friendly, quiet, kept to himself, but there were tiny red flags. He'd avoid certain conversations, especially whenever women were around, and sometimes his eyes would dart uncomfortably when someone mentioned a female friend. I brushed it off at first, thinking I was overanalyzing. One evening, we all went out to a small concert. Me, my partner, a mutual friend, and my roommate. During the night, I noticed my roommate and our friend exchanging awkward, tense glances. Later, she pulled me aside and whispered, "Please, never let him near me again." I was stunned and pressed her gently for details. She revealed that years before, my roommate had assaulted her while they were acquaintances. She'd kept it secret for years, and he had been convicted and served time. Apparently, he still carried around letters he wrote to her, pleading for forgiveness, as if those notes could erase what he had done. Story 16. After 6 months of dating a charming guy who constantly exaggerated his life and flew into rages over over trivial things. I finally went to his apartment while he was out and discovered a hidden stash of cocaine and pills that explained every lie, every mood swing, and every misunderstanding he'd ever gaslit me about. I had been dating this guy for about 6 months. At first, he seemed charming, funny, attentive, the kind of person who made everything feel exciting. But small cracks started appearing. He would exaggerate stories about work, claims of being promoted in days, heroic tasks he supposedly accomplished, but nothing ever added up. I shrugged it off at first, chalking it up to ego. Then things got stranger. Random people would message me angrily, claiming he owed them money or had double-crossed them in some way. I had never met these people, and he brushed it off like it was no big deal. I ignored it. I'll take a quick break here to remind you, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let us know in the comments if you're enjoying the story, and tell us if something like this has ever happened to you. He also had a habit of showing sudden fits of anger over trivial things, like the barista spelling his name wrong, or someone parking slightly crooked. I learned to tiptoe around him. The red flags kept piling up, but I stayed. Maybe I thought I could handle it. Until one night, I went to his apartment while he was out and found a hidden stash of pills and small bags of what looked like cocaine. It hit me all at once. He had been using drugs heavily the entire time, lying about his life, his job, everything. Worse, he had been keeping this under my nose the entire relationship. That was it. I left his apartment immediately, took nothing but my keys, and never looked back. I realized some people are masters of deceit, and no amount of charm can outweigh the danger of trusting someone who hides a life like that from you. Story 17. I googled the charming guy I'd been texting before our first coffee date and found a news article about him being investigated for fraud, but I went anyway, only to have him casually admit over lattes that he was still running shady financial schemes on the side and didn't care who got hurt. A few years ago, I met a guy at a mutual friend's birthday party. He seemed interesting, funny, confident, the type who drew people in effortlessly. We started chatting over texts, and after a few days, we decided to grab coffee one evening. Curiosity got the better of me, so I googled him before meeting. That's when my stomach dropped. There was a local news article detailing that he had been under investigation for fraud at his previous workplace. Apparently, he'd manipulated clients' accounts for personal gain and had been forced to resign, but no mention of jail time. I debated whether to meet him or not, and in the end, I went. He showed up smiling, charming as ever, and started talking about his past mistakes in vague, almost bragging ways. It quickly became clear that he had no remorse. He casually admitted he still tinkered with shady financial schemes on the side and didn't care who got hurt. I felt sick. Everything about him suddenly made sense. The little white lies, the way he always skirted questions about his jobs. That was the instant I knew I couldn't be around him. Story 18. My quiet coworker who joked about risk-taking and kept to himself seemed perfectly normal, until a bored night of Googling revealed he'd been convicted of deliberately running his car into a man and killing him after a street argument, and I'd been stacking boxes next to him for weeks without knowing I was working beside someone capable of intentional murder. I used to work at a small warehouse, and there was this new guy who started around the same time as me. He seemed normal enough, quiet, kept to himself, occasionally funny, but nothing about him screamed red flag to me. We'd exchange small talk here and there, and eventually, we got on okay. A few weeks in, a colleague casually mentioned she'd heard rumors that he had a criminal past. I didn't press it. He seemed like someone who'd paid his dues, whatever that meant. I figured it was better to let it go. One night, I was bored and decided to Google his name. He had a pretty uncommon one, so it wasn't hard. What I found made me freeze. An old local news article detailed that he had been convicted of deliberately causing a car accident that killed a man. Not a mistake or a momentary lapse, but a calculated act after an argument on the street. He'd served a few years and then quietly disappeared from the public eye until landing at our warehouse. Everything about his behavior suddenly made sense. The way he'd casually joke about risk-taking, the stories he told that didn't quite add up. I realized that I had unknowingly been working next to someone capable of intentional violence. I stopped talking to him entirely the next day. I avoided him at work, kept my distance, and never looked back. The knowledge that he had knowingly taken a life completely shattered any notion of trust one had in him. Even years later, the thought still creeps up when I hear his name. Story 19. My friend started dating a guy I knew from work. Seemed fine, a little arrogant, until 3 months and she called me sobbing because he'd been secretly gambling away his money, blamed her for not trusting him enough, and had taken out a loan in her name without consent because it was for both of them. I had a friend who started seeing a guy she'd known casually casually for years. I also knew him from work. We had a friendly rapport, joked around, grabbed lunch sometimes, but never anything serious. When she asked for my opinion about him, I thought he seemed fine, if a little arrogant. 3 months into their relationship, she confided in me that he had been lying about his finances the entire time. Not small lies. He had told her he was saving up for a house, but in reality, he was funneling all his money into gambling and hiding his debts. She confronted him, and instead of apologizing, he blamed her for not trusting him enough and even hinted that she should help cover his losses. That night, she called me crying. He had taken out a loan in her name without her consent, claiming it was for both of them. The betrayal was beyond anything I had imagined. I went straight to her apartment to support her, and she was visibly shaken. After that, I stopped speaking to him entirely. I refused to even respond to his attempts to explain himself. The combination of deception, financial exploitation, and utter disregard for someone else's life made it impossible to consider keeping any sort of relationship. My friend eventually recovered, and we grew closer because of it. We both learned to trust each other more carefully, and I am grateful that the darkest secret of that one person showed me who I should actually value in my life. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Got a story to share? Drop it in the comments, and let us know which one was your favorite.